The Solovetsky Monastery emerged from the White Sea archipelago in 1436 as a comprehensive system for organizing human activity within precisely defined spatial and temporal boundaries. When Zosima of Solovki established the monastic community on Bolshoi Solovetsky Island, 165 kilometers from the nearest mainland settlement of Kem, the geographic isolation represented more than spiritual retreat from worldly concerns. The location established the foundational design parameter that would define institutional operations for 5 centuries, controlled access through natural containment barriers that eliminated external support networks while ensuring administrative autonomy over resident populations. The monastery functioned according to the rule of St. Basil, a regulatory framework that established hierarchical command structures, standardized behavioral protocols, and systematic mechanisms for surveillance and behavioral modification. This rule assumed that residents would voluntarily submit to institutional authority through shared spiritual conviction, creating compliance through internalized religious motivation rather than external coercion. The regulatory architecture embedded within this framework would prove remarkably transferable when the spiritual foundation disappeared, but the need for population control intensified. The monastic design premise rested on several critical assumptions that shaped every aspect of institutional operations. Primary among these was the assumption that geographic isolation would eliminate escape opportunities while reducing external interference in internal management decisions. The monastery's location required boat transportation for all access, creating natural barriers that functioned as both protective and containment mechanisms. This isolation assumption proved accurate in its operational effects, but critically flawed in its underlying logic. The geography provided effective population control regardless of resident motivation or institutional legitimacy. The architectural ensemble constructed between 1582 and 1595 transformed the monastery from a religious settlement into a fortified institution capable of withstanding external military threats while maintaining internal population control. The defensive walls, ranging from 8 to 11 meters in height and 4 to 6 meters in thickness, connected 8 strategically positioned towers that provided comprehensive surveillance coverage of both internal activities and external approaches. The fortification system established clear boundaries between internal and external space, creating what institutional designers would later recognize as the essential architectural requirements for total institutional control. These walls served dual functions that revealed the fundamental compatibility between defensive and carceral architecture. External protection required the same structural elements as internal containment: impermeable barriers, controlled access points, and elevated observation positions. The monastery's builders had inadvertently created a prison-ready facility while designing for military defense, establishing architectural precedents that would prove remarkably suitable for correctional applications when the institution's purpose changed. The economic foundation of monastic operations demonstrated another critical design assumption: that productive labor could sustain institutional operations while providing behavioral discipline for residents. The monastery operated extensive salt works on nearby islands, fishing enterprises throughout the archipelago, agricultural installations on cleared lands, and manufacturing workshops within the main compound. This economic model required no external subsidies when functioning according to design specifications, creating institutional self-sufficiency that would prove essential when external support systems became unreliable or hostile. The labor organization system revealed the sophisticated administrative hierarchy embedded within monastic operations. The abbot functioned as executive administrator with comprehensive authority over all institutional activities. Cellarer monks managed resource distribution, production scheduling, and financial operations. Elder monks supervised workshop activities and maintained discipline among working populations. Lay brothers performed manual labor under direct supervision, while maintaining residence within the controlled institutional environment. This hierarchical structure provided clear command chains, systematic accountability mechanisms, and graduated authority distribution that would function effectively regardless of the underlying motivation for compliance. The monastery's role as a site of exile and punishment established operational precedents for managing involuntary populations, decades before the 1923 transformation. Beginning in the late 16th century, Russian state authorities used the monastery as a detention facility for political dissidents, religious heretics, and other individuals whose continued presence in mainstream society posed perceived threats to established order. The institution of monastery prison developed specific procedures for managing residents who had not voluntarily chosen monastic life, but had been compelled to accept institutional residence through external legal processes. These early correctional operations revealed both the effectiveness and limitations of the monastic design when applied to resistant populations. The monastery's geographic isolation eliminated escape opportunities regardless of resident motivation. The economic integration of punishment and productive labor reduced administrative costs while providing structured activity that minimized idle time available for resistance planning. The hierarchical administrative structure enabled systematic management of diverse populations with varying security requirements and compliance levels. However, the correctional applications also exposed critical vulnerabilities in the monastery's design assumptions. The confession system, designed to provide spiritual guidance and maintain community harmony, became a source of false intelligence when applied to hostile residents, who provided deliberately misleading information during mandatory spiritual consultations. The surveillance architecture, adequate for monitoring willing religious communities, proved insufficient for detecting organized resistance activities among politically motivated prisoners who actively sought opportunities for escape or rebellion. The monastery's information architecture relied heavily on voluntary compliance with reporting requirements and behavioral expectations. Regular confession provided systematic intelligence gathering about individual psychological states, social tensions, and potential problems, but only when residents genuinely participated in the spiritual process. The cellular organization of monastic life created redundant monitoring systems through multiple layers of supervision, but these systems functioned effectively only when supervisors could trust the accuracy of information provided by those under their authority. The most significant design assumption involved the relationship between institutional legitimacy and behavioral compliance. The monastic system functioned effectively because residents accepted the spiritual authority of the institution and viewed submission to monastic discipline as religiously necessary for their personal salvation. This acceptance created voluntary compliance that eliminated the need for extensive coercive apparatus while ensuring cooperative participation in productive activities. When this spiritual foundation eroded, the same architectural and organizational systems that had maintained order through consent could potentially maintain order through coercion, but only if the administrative systems adapted to account for fundamentally different resident motivations and behavioral patterns. The monastery's design contained latent capabilities for correctional applications that would become apparent only when the institution faced populations that rejected rather than embraced its authority. The surveillance capabilities embedded within the monastery's architectural design provided comprehensive monitoring without requiring technological enhancement. The central cathedral complex offered elevated observation points overlooking all residential and work areas. The enclosed courtyard design eliminated blind spots and ensured that movement between buildings occurred under potential observation. The positioning of guard towers at strategic points along the fortification perimeter provided early warning of external threats, while maintaining sight lines across the interior compound. These architectural features had been designed to ensure appropriate monastic behavior and coordinate religious activities, but they possessed inherent capabilities for security surveillance that would prove remarkably effective for correctional applications. The monastery's builders had created without intention an institutional environment optimized for population control through environmental design rather than technological systems. The economic model underlying monastic operations demonstrated the feasibility of integrating punishment with productive activity in ways that reduced rather than increased administrative costs. The monastery's workshops produced goods for both internal consumption and external trade, generating revenue that supported institutional operations while providing structured activity for residents. The salt works, in particular, required intensive manual labor that could absorb large numbers of workers while producing valuable commodities for regional and national markets. This economic integration established operational precedents that would prove crucial when the institution's population and purpose changed dramatically. The demonstration that controlled populations could generate economic value rather than representing pure administrative cost provided a sustainable model for large-scale institutional operations that would influence correctional policy throughout the Soviet period. The monastery's success as a total institution rested on the convergence of geographic, architectural, economic, and administrative factors that created comprehensive environmental control over resident populations. The design achieved effective population management through multiple redundant systems that functioned independently, while reinforcing each other's effectiveness. Geographic isolation prevented external contact, architectural barriers controlled internal movement, economic integration provided behavioral incentives, and administrative hierarchies ensured systematic coordination of all activities. These design elements had evolved through centuries of institutional development to address the specific challenges of managing religious communities in remote locations. The solutions developed for these challenges would prove remarkably applicable to entirely different institutional purposes when the spiritual foundation that had originally justified and motivated the system no longer applied, but the need for population control had become more rather than less urgent. The false assumption embedded within the monastic design was not that geographic isolation, hierarchical administration, integrated economics, and architectural surveillance could control human populations. These elements demonstrably could and did achieve effective control. The false assumption was that these control mechanisms required spiritual justification and voluntary compliance to function effectively. When this assumption proved incorrect, the monastery's institutional capabilities would be revealed in their full extent, providing a proven template for systematic population control that had been tested and refined through centuries of practical application. 7:52 p.m. The monastery's institutional effectiveness depended on several latent conditions that remained invisible during normal religious operations but created systematic vulnerabilities when the institution confronted populations with fundamentally different motivations and behavioral patterns. These vulnerabilities had developed through centuries of optimization for managing voluntary religious communities and would prove catastrophic when applied without modification to politically motivated prisoners who actively rejected institutional authority. The primary latent vulnerability involved the monastery's dependence on consent-based compliance mechanisms embedded throughout its operational systems. The rule of St. Basil functioned effectively because monks voluntarily submitted to institutional authority through shared spiritual conviction that made obedience religiously meaningful rather than externally imposed. Every administrative procedure, from daily scheduling to work assignments to disciplinary protocols, assumed resident cooperation based on internalized religious motivation. When political prisoners replaced voluntary monks, this foundational assumption collapsed completely, but the administrative systems continued to operate according to protocols designed for cooperative populations. The monastery's training protocols revealed systematic preparation gaps that became critical when institutional purpose changed. Administrative staff received extensive instruction in religious leadership, spiritual guidance, theological interpretation, and liturgical coordination, but virtually no preparation for managing hostile populations, organized resistance, or security emergencies. The curriculum emphasized prayer, meditation, scriptural study, and pastoral care rather than conflict resolution, crowd control, emergency response, or systematic surveillance of unwilling residents. This training bias created predictable response failures when administrators encountered situations outside their institutional experience. Religious leaders possessed sophisticated knowledge for addressing spiritual crises, interpersonal conflicts within believing communities, and administrative coordination of voluntary activities, but lacked practical skills for managing organized opposition, planned escape attempts, or systematic resistance to institutional authority. The human factors analysis reveals that administrators consistently misinterpreted prisoner behavior through religious rather than correctional frameworks, leading to inappropriate responses that often escalated rather than resolved conflicts. The confession system represented a particularly critical training vulnerability because it served dual functions that became contradictory under correctional applications. For voluntary monastic communities, confession provided both spiritual guidance for individual development and administrative intelligence about community dynamics, personal problems, and potential issues requiring leadership attention. The system functioned effectively because monks genuinely sought spiritual assistance and provided accurate information about their internal states and community observations. When applied to hostile political prisoners, the confession requirement continued to generate intelligence, but the quality and reliability of information deteriorated systematically. Prisoners quickly learned to provide false or misleading responses during mandatory spiritual consultations, rendering the intelligence-gathering function counterproductive while consuming administrative time and creating false impressions of institutional understanding about prisoner attitudes and activities. Administrative staff, trained to interpret confession responses as genuine spiritual communication, often failed to recognize deliberate deception until systematic intelligence failures became apparent through other means. The monastery's surveillance architecture exposed fundamental limitations when scaled beyond its original design parameters. The architectural sight lines, observation positions, and monitoring capabilities had been optimized for ensuring appropriate behavior among 200 to 300 cooperative residents who moved individually through predictable daily routines. The system provided adequate coverage for detecting violations of monastic discipline, unauthorized conversations, improper behavior, failure to participate in required activities, but proved insufficient for monitoring organized resistance activities among larger populations of hostile residents. The guard force composition created additional human factors vulnerabilities that became apparent only under stress conditions. The monastery's security personnel consisted primarily of religious brothers, with limited training in physical confrontation, emergency response, or systematic security protocols. Their primary qualifications involved spiritual development and administrative reliability rather than professional security capabilities. When confronted with organized prisoner resistance, escape attempts, or violent incidents, these guards often lacked the training, equipment, and institutional support necessary for effective response. Communication systems within the monastery reflected another critical design limitation that remained hidden during normal operations. The bell tower served as the primary coordination mechanism for announcing prayers, meals, work periods, and other scheduled activities throughout the monastic day. This system provided adequate communication for coordinating voluntary religious activities among cooperative populations but proved completely inadequate for emergency response, security alerts, or rapid coordination during crisis situations. The monastery's economic systems contained latent vulnerabilities that became apparent when resident motivation changed from spiritual to survival-focused. The workshops, agricultural installations, and manufacturing facilities had been designed for voluntary religious labor, where spiritual meaning provided motivation for productive activity regardless of immediate material rewards. Monks approached work as a form of prayer, finding religious significance in productive contribution to community welfare and institutional sustainability. Political prisoners possessed no such spiritual motivation and evaluated work assignments purely in terms of personal survival, potential resistance opportunities, and escape possibilities. The same workshop spaces that had fostered religious contemplation became sites for planning resistance activities, manufacturing contraband materials, and coordinating organized opposition to institutional authority. Tools and materials intended for productive religious activities could be readily converted to weapons, escape equipment, or communication devices by residents with appropriate motivation and technical knowledge. The monastery's resource allocation systems revealed systematic biases toward cooperation that created exploitable vulnerabilities. Food distribution, medical care, work assignments, and living accommodations had been organized according to religious principles that emphasized community welfare and individual spiritual development. The systems assumed that residents would accept resource allocation decisions as expressions of legitimate institutional authority and would not attempt to manipulate or circumvent distribution mechanisms for personal advantage. Prisoners approached these same systems as opportunities for gaining advantages, acquiring contraband materials, or developing intelligence about institutional operations. Food distribution schedules provided information about guard rotations and administrative routines. Medical care access offered opportunities for acquiring potentially useful pharmaceutical materials. Work assignments revealed institutional vulnerabilities and potential escape routes. Living arrangements enabled coordination among prisoners with similar political orientations or resistance capabilities. The monastery's documentation and record-keeping systems reflected institutional priorities that became liabilities under correctional applications. Administrative records emphasized religious development, spiritual progress, community contributions, and liturgical participation rather than security assessments, behavioral analysis, or risk evaluation. The information architecture provided comprehensive data about residents' spiritual lives but minimal intelligence about their practical capabilities, political orientations, or resistance potential. This documentation bias meant that administrators lacked systematic information about prisoner backgrounds, organizational, affiliations, technical skills, or escape capabilities. When security incidents occurred, administrative staff had no reliable database for assessing which residents posed the greatest risks, which possessed relevant technical knowledge, or which maintained connections to external resistance networks. The institutional memory contained extensive information about managing religious communities but virtually nothing about controlling politically motivated opposition groups. Alarm and emergency response protocols within the monastery had been designed for managing religious emergencies, medical crises among elderly residents, fires in wooden buildings, storms threatening island infrastructure rather than security emergencies involving organized resistance or escape attempts. The response procedures emphasized community cooperation, spiritual support, and administrative coordination rather than rapid containment, systematic communication, or professional security intervention. These protocol limitations became apparent during the first serious security incidents when traditional monastic emergency responses proved not merely inadequate but actively counterproductive for managing hostile prisoner populations. The institutional knowledge base contained sophisticated procedures for addressing spiritual crises but minimal guidance for handling systematic resistance to institutional authority. The most dangerous latent vulnerability involved the monastery's external relationships and reputation within the broader Russian Orthodox community and political system. As a respected religious institution, the monastery had developed extensive networks with ecclesiastical authorities, government officials, and regional populations who expected the institution to maintain its traditional religious character regardless of changing administrative arrangements. These external expectations created operational constraints that interfered with necessary adaptations for correctional management. Religious leaders, government officials, and local communities maintained assumptions about the monastery's character and operations that became liabilities when institutional purpose changed. External pressure to preserve traditional practices conflicted with security requirements, creating systematic tensions that undermined effective prisoner management while failing to maintain authentic religious operations. The monastery's historical success had created institutional confidence in traditional methods that became a cognitive bias, preventing recognition of changed circumstances. Administrative staff continued to apply religious solutions to correctional problems long after these approaches had demonstrated their ineffectiveness, partly due to institutional inertia and partly due to lack of alternative knowledge or training for different approaches. Training deficiencies extended beyond individual skill gaps to encompass systematic organizational learning capabilities. The monastery possessed sophisticated institutional memory for refining religious practices, improving spiritual guidance, and enhancing community harmony, but lacked systematic methods for analyzing security failures, adapting to hostile populations, or developing professional correctional capabilities. The organizational learning systems that had enabled centuries of successful religious development proved inadequate for rapid adaptation to fundamentally different institutional requirements. These latent conditions would remain dormant as long as the monastery served its traditional religious purpose with voluntary populations sharing institutional spiritual objectives. However, when confronted with politically motivated prisoners who actively rejected institutional legitimacy and possessed organizational skills for systematic resistance, every hidden vulnerability would become apparent simultaneously, creating cascading failures that traditional monastic management systems could not address through incremental adjustments or spiritual remedies. The administrative transfer of June 13, 1923, created the first systematic divergence between the monastery's institutional design assumptions and operational reality, when the Arkhangelsk Provincial Executive Committee formally transferred control from ecclesiastical to secular authorities while maintaining the legal fiction that religious operations would continue alongside new social purposes. This administrative euphemism concealed a fundamental transformation that would expose every latent vulnerability in the monastery's 5th-century institutional design. The transfer document itself represented a critical artifact of institutional failure because it attempted to preserve operational continuity while introducing incompatible administrative objectives. The order specified that monastic religious activities would continue under state supervision while the facility simultaneously served correctional functions for political prisoners. This dual-purpose mandate ignored fundamental incompatibilities between religious and correctional institutional logic, creating operational contradictions that made systematic failure inevitable rather than possible. The first prisoner transport arrived on July 15, 1923, consisting of 316 individuals classified under Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code for counter-revolutionary activities. These prisoners possessed characteristics that directly contradicted the monastery's behavioral assumptions and operational requirements. Unlike voluntary monks who had chosen religious life and accepted institutional authority through spiritual conviction, the prisoners actively rejected state legitimacy, maintained organizational networks with external political movements, and possessed ideological motivations for systematic resistance to institutional control. The demographic analysis reveals the magnitude of the design mismatch between institutional capabilities and population requirements. The monastery had been optimized for managing 200 to 300 voluntary religious residents with shared spiritual objectives and cooperative attitudes. The sudden introduction of over 300 hostile political prisoners created immediate overcrowding while fundamentally altering the behavioral dynamics that had sustained institutional operations for centuries. Automatic responses built into the monastery's operational systems failed systematically when applied to the new population. The traditional wake-up bell, intended to call residents to morning prayers, became a signal for coordinated prisoner resistance activities. Instead of moving individually and quietly to religious observances, prisoners organized collective responses that transformed routine administrative procedures into confrontational events requiring security intervention. The monastery's disciplinary systems revealed their inadequacy during the first serious incident on August 3, 1923, when 3 prisoners overpowered a workshop supervisor, acquired carpentry tools, and attempted to breach the main gate during the evening meal period. The incident exposed multiple systematic failures in institutional design assumptions. Workshop security had been designed assuming resident cooperation rather than active hostility. Guard protocols anticipated isolated disciplinary problems among willing residents rather than coordinated attacks by organized groups, and alarm systems provided insufficient notification speed for emergency response to security breaches. Expected behavioral patterns based on centuries of monastic experience diverged dramatically from observed prisoner conduct in ways that invalidated fundamental operational assumptions. Monks had traditionally approached workshop activities as spiritual exercises, using manual labor as opportunities for contemplation and prayer. Prisoners evaluated the same activities as potential sources of weapons, escape tools, and intelligence about institutional vulnerabilities. The confession system, which had functioned effectively for centuries as both spiritual guidance and administrative intelligence gathering, became actively counterproductive when applied to hostile prisoners. During mandatory spiritual consultations, prisoners provided deliberately false information about their attitudes, activities, and knowledge of resistance activities. Administrative staff, trained to interpret confession responses as genuine spiritual communication, initially accepted this false intelligence as accurate, creating systematic misunderstanding of actual prisoner behavior and organizational capabilities. The primary diagnostic failure occurred in administrative interpretation of prisoner behavioral patterns through inappropriate analytical frameworks. staff members attempted to understand organized political resistance using religious rather than correctional analytical models. They interpreted collective prisoner activities as expressions of spiritual community rather than recognizing systematic opposition tactics. This interpretative error led to consistently inappropriate responses that escalated rather than contained security problems. Surveillance system limitations became apparent, as the monastery's observation capabilities proved inadequate for monitoring populations, actively seeking to conceal their activities from institutional authority. The architectural sightlines and guard positions that had ensured appropriate monastic behavior could not detect coordinated resistance planning among prisoners who deliberately avoided surveillance and used legitimate activities to mask organizational meetings. The monastery's communication systems revealed critical inadequacies during the first major collective resistance event on September 12, 1923, when over 200 prisoners coordinated a hunger strike to protest overcrowding conditions. The bell tower system that had effectively coordinated religious activities for centuries could not provide rapid communication between different areas of the compound during the security emergency. Administrative staff had no reliable means of assessing the scope of prisoner participation, coordinating response activities, or communicating with external authorities about the developing crisis. Traditional monastery responses to food refusal, spiritual counseling, prayer, and gradual persuasion proved completely ineffective for managing organized political protest. Prisoners rejected spiritual authority entirely and viewed religious approaches as evidence of administrative weakness rather than legitimate institutional guidance. The hunger strike continued for 6 days before administrators abandoned traditional methods and implemented forced feeding procedures that violated established monastery practices while failing to resolve the underlying organizational problems. The critical instrument failure involved the fundamental assumption that institutional legitimacy would ensure basic resident compliance regardless of specific policy disagreements. Monastic discipline had functioned because monks accepted the spiritual authority of institutional leadership and viewed obedience as religiously necessary. When prisoners rejected not merely specific institutional policies, but the entire basis of institutional authority, compliance systems collapsed completely. The point of operational divergence occurred when remaining monks began responding to the changed institutional environment by questioning authority systems they had previously accepted without reservation. Monks, who had voluntarily submitted to institutional discipline for decades, started challenging administrative decisions when they observed prisoners successfully resisting the same rules. The compliance system that had maintained monastic order for centuries could not function when residents had visible evidence that institutional authority could be successfully challenged. Two-phase breakdown of institutional control became apparent as the original population and new population created mutually reinforcing resistance to administrative authority. Monks lost confidence in institutional leadership when traditional religious responses proved ineffective for managing obvious security problems. Prisoners gained confidence in resistance activities when they observed that institutional authority lacked effective responses to systematic opposition. Mass balance indicators revealed systematic deterioration in every aspect of institutional operations. Food shortages increased as prison populations grew beyond supply system capacity, while prisoner resistance disrupted traditional procurement and distribution procedures. Sanitation systems designed for 300 cooperative residents failed catastrophically when supporting 800-plus hostile prisoners who actively sought to overwhelm institutional infrastructure. Medical facilities intended for treating minor ailments among healthy religious residents could not handle malnutrition, communicable diseases, and violence-related injuries among the prisoner population. The monastery's traditional medical approach emphasized spiritual healing and basic care for elderly monks, but possessed no capabilities for managing systematic health crises in overcrowded, hostile populations. Net flow analysis demonstrated that the monastery was losing rather than gaining institutional control over time, as each administrative response to prisoner resistance created new problems while failing to resolve existing ones. Escape attempts escalated from isolated individual efforts to coordinated group activities that required increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. Internal violence increased from personal disputes among monks to systematic factional conflicts among prisoner groups that threatened overall institutional security. The monastery's information architecture failed to provide accurate intelligence about deteriorating conditions because existing reporting systems had been designed for religious rather than security purposes. Administrative reports to higher authorities consistently understated the severity of control problems, partly due to staff inexperience with correctional assessment, and partly due to institutional incentives that rewarded reporting improvement rather than acknowledging systematic failures. The feedback loop between deteriorating physical conditions and increased organized resistance created an accelerating crisis that traditional monastery management systems could not address through incremental adjustments. Each security failure strengthened prisoner organization while demonstrating administrative inadequacy, creating a downward spiral in institutional authority that would require fundamental transformation rather than tactical modifications to reverse. The administrative assumption that dual-purpose operations could preserve religious institutional character while adding correctional functions had created impossible operational requirements that guaranteed systematic failure regardless of administrative competence or resource availability. The monastery's design could support effective religious operations or effective correctional operations, but not both simultaneously without fundamental redesign that would eliminate the characteristics that had made it successful as a religious institution. 8:33 p.m. The breakdown of the monastery's original control systems followed predictable patterns that revealed the underlying physics of institutional transformation as each attempt to maintain traditional monastic operations accelerated the transition towards systematic coercive management. The failure chain proceeded through distinct phases where the monastery's centuries-old systems encountered conditions for which they had never been designed, creating cascade effects that made complete institutional transformation inevitable. The first phase involved authority legitimacy erosion, as prisoners successfully demonstrated that institutional rules could be violated without immediate consequences sufficient to deter continued resistance. Traditional monastic disciplinary measures, prayer assignments, dietary restrictions, cell confinement for contemplation, had been designed to encourage spiritual reflection among willing residents who accepted the religious value of penance. When applied to political prisoners who rejected spiritual authority entirely, these measures proved not merely ineffective, but actively counterproductive by demonstrating administrative weakness. The mathematical relationship between population density and surveillance effectiveness revealed critical threshold effects in institutional control capabilities. The monastery's observation system had been optimized for monitoring 200 to 300 cooperative residents moving individually through predictable religious routines. When prisoner populations exceeded 600 individuals who deliberately coordinated activities to avoid surveillance, the same architectural sightlines that had ensured appropriate monastic behavior became inadequate for detecting organized resistance activities. Surveillance system overload occurred as the monastery's observation capabilities proved insufficient for tracking coordinated opposition activities among hostile populations. Guards positioned in traditional locations could monitor general movement patterns, but could not detect specific planning activities, contraband concealment, or communication networks that prisoners established using legitimate monastery activities as cover for resistance coordination. The monastery's communication systems revealed fundamental incompatibilities between religious and correctional administration when emergency situations required rapid coordination rather than traditional contemplative decision-making processes. The bell tower system that had effectively announced prayers, meals, and work periods for centuries could not provide the immediate, specific communication necessary for coordinating security responses during escape attempts, violent incidents, or organized resistance activities. Resource allocation conflicts emerged as the institution attempted to serve simultaneous religious and correctional functions with infrastructure designed exclusively for cooperative religious communities. Food supplies adequate for 300 monks could not sustain 800 prisoners while maintaining nutritional standards necessary for institutional stability. Workshop materials sufficient for religious craft activities became inadequate when prisoner populations required productive labor to justify detention costs while providing structured activity to prevent resistance organization. The critical feedback loop mechanism involved escalating security measures that undermined the monastery's religious character, while failing to achieve reliable prisoner control. Each security enhancement, additional guards, restricted movement, enhanced surveillance equipment, moved the institution further from its spiritual origins without providing effective control over prisoner behavior. This transformation alienated remaining monks while demonstrating to prisoners that the administration was reactive, rather than confident in its authority. Thermal threshold analysis of institutional breakdown reveals that certain organizational changes became irreversible once implemented. The introduction of armed guards to manage prisoner resistance crossed a fundamental boundary beyond which the monastery could no longer function as a religious institution. Armed force became necessary for routine operations, but its presence destroyed the spiritual atmosphere that had sustained monastic life for centuries. Population scaling analysis demonstrates mathematical inevitability in institutional failure when design limits are exceeded. The monastery's waste management systems had been designed for 300 residents, producing typical monastic waste volumes. When prisoner populations doubled while generating higher waste volumes due to different dietary patterns and health conditions, the sanitation infrastructure failed systematically, creating health emergencies that overwhelmed medical systems and required resource diversion from other essential operations. Cascade failure patterns appeared as problems in one operational area, triggered systematic failures in related institutional systems. Food shortage riots led to medical emergencies when prisoners sustained injuries during violent confrontations with security personnel. Medical emergencies overwhelmed health services designed for routine monastic care, creating sanitation problems as medical waste and infectious disease management exceeded system capabilities. Sanitation failures generated disease outbreaks requiring quarantine measures that disrupted work schedules and reduced productive output. Reduced productivity worsened food shortages as institutional self-sufficiency declined, completing the cascade cycle. The monastery's integrated design, originally a source of operational efficiency for managing cooperative religious communities, became a systematic liability when managing resistant populations because failures in any subsystem affected all related operations. Unlike purpose-built facilities with redundant systems and isolated operations, the monastery's integration meant that prisoner resistance in workshops affected food production, which influenced health services, which impacted sanitation management, which undermined security operations. The point of no return occurred mathematically when the cost of maintaining traditional monastery operations exceeded the economic resources generated by institutional activities. Monastic economic self-sufficiency had depended on voluntary labor motivated by spiritual conviction that approached productive work as religious exercise. When prisoners replaced monks in workshops, productivity declined while security costs increased exponentially, creating an economic deficit that required either external subsidization or fundamental operational changes. Void formation in institutional authority created spaces where neither traditional monastery rules nor improvised security regulations provided effective behavioral guidance. During periods of administrative uncertainty when traditional responses had failed but new procedures had not yet been established, prisoners filled the authority vacuum with informal governance structures that often proved more effective than official administrative systems. The mathematical progression of resistance escalation followed predictable patterns as successful opposition activities encouraged broader prisoner participation while demonstrating administrative inadequacy. Individual escape attempts increased to coordinated group efforts when prisoners observed that security responses were inadequate. Isolated acts of defiance expanded to organized work slowdowns when administrative responses proved inconsistent. Personal disputes evolved into factional violence when institutional authority could not maintain effective conflict resolution. Diagnostic misleading occurred systematically as administrators misinterpreted institutional breakdown indicators through inappropriate analytical frameworks. Reduced prisoner complaints were interpreted as evidence of successful adaptation rather than recognition that formal complaints were pointless. Decreased escape attempts during certain periods reflected improved prisoner organization and tactical planning rather than acceptance of confinement. Administrative reports showing improving conditions actually documented the monastery's transition from religious institution to de facto prison as traditional measures of institutional success became irrelevant. Mass inventory loss became apparent through systematic accounting of institutional assets and capabilities. Traditional monastery property, religious artifacts, library materials, workshop tools disappeared through theft, destruction, or administrative confiscation for security purposes. Simultaneously, the institution acquired assets incompatible with religious purposes: security equipment, restraint devices, surveillance materials, and weapons. The physical transformation paralleled the complete institutional transition from sacred to carceral space. The monastery's transformation followed thermodynamic principles where energy input required for maintaining institutional control exceeded energy output generated by productive institutional activities. Administrative effort to manage prisoner resistance consumed resources faster than prisoner labor could generate value, creating a negative energy balance that required continuous external support to maintain operations. This energy deficit eliminated the self-sufficiency that had characterized successful monastic operations for centuries. Circulation failure appeared as normal flows of people, materials, and information through the monastery ceased to function according to traditional patterns optimized for religious operations. Monks could no longer move freely through spaces designated as security zones. Traditional procurement and distribution systems failed when applied to prisoner populations with different needs and consumption patterns. Information flows designed for spiritual guidance became inadequate for security intelligence requirements. The mathematical inevitability of complete institutional transformation became apparent when prisoner populations exceeded remaining monastic populations by ratios greater than 3:1. At this demographic threshold, traditional monastery operations could not continue even in severely modified form because the institutional environment had been completely altered by security requirements that dominated all other considerations. Two-phase flow breakdown occurred as the monastery's systems encountered conditions outside their design parameters, creating operational states that traditional management approaches could not address. The institution entered a transitional phase where neither religious nor correctional management approaches proved effective, requiring systematic redesign rather than tactical adjustments to achieve operational stability. 8:38 p.m. Following the complete breakdown of traditional monastery management systems, Soviet administrators implemented stabilization measures that inadvertently created the organizational template for the entire Gulag system. These measures, designed as emergency responses to immediate operational crises, established systematic patterns that would define Soviet correctional institutions for the following 3 decades, while demonstrating that effective prison management required abandoning rather than modifying traditional institutional approaches. The first successful stabilization measure involved administrative segregation of remaining religious residents from prisoner populations, eliminating the cognitive dissonance that had undermined institutional authority when monks and prisoners coexisted under incompatible behavioral expectations. By September 1924, all monks had been relocated to other religious institutions or secularized as civilian workers, creating operational clarity that allowed administrators to focus exclusively on correctional rather than competing institutional objectives. This segregation established the fundamental principle that effective prison management required single-purpose institutional design, rather than attempting to serve multiple organizational objectives simultaneously. The elimination of religious operations removed administrative confusion about appropriate responses to behavioral problems, while ending prisoner observations of differential treatment between willing and unwilling residents that had encouraged resistance activities. Production quota systems replaced voluntary monastic labor with mandatory prisoner work requirements tied directly to food rations, housing assignments, and disciplinary privileges. Administrators discovered that prisoner productivity could exceed traditional monastic levels when supported by systematic incentives and penalties, rather than spiritual motivation. The monastery's workshops, operating under quota management with measurable output targets, generated surplus production that supported institutional operations while providing exportable goods that contributed to regional economic development. The quota system artifact represents a critical innovation because it solved the fundamental economic problem that had made traditional monastery operations unsustainable under correctional applications. Voluntary monastic labor had been motivated by spiritual conviction that approached productive work as religious exercise, creating reliable productivity without external incentives. Mandatory prison labor achieved comparable or superior productivity through systematic material incentives that aligned prisoner self-interest with institutional requirements. Implementation of systematic classification systems enabled administrators to manage diverse prisoner populations with varying security requirements, political orientations, and administrative needs through specialized treatment protocols rather than uniform institutional approaches. The monastery's existing cell infrastructure provided physical resources for implementing isolation protocols, disciplinary confinement, protective custody arrangements, and graduated privilege systems that customized treatment while maintaining overall population control. Classification effectiveness depended on comprehensive documentation of prisoner backgrounds, behavioral assessments, work capabilities, and security risks that enabled informed decision-making about housing assignments, work details, and supervision levels. This systematic approach replaced the improvised responses that had characterized the crisis period with professional correctional management based on established protocols and measurable criteria. Graduated classification systems proved essential for managing political prisoners who possessed sophisticated organizational capabilities and maintained external connections that required specialized security measures. Administrative segregation of prisoners according to political affiliations, technical skills, and leadership capabilities prevented the formation of unified resistance organizations while enabling targeted supervision of individuals who posed the greatest security risks. Secondary crisis management revealed the effectiveness of collective punishment protocols for maintaining institutional order among politically motivated prisoners when individual disciplinary measures proved insufficient to deter organized resistance activities. Group sanctions that affected entire housing units or work details for violations committed by individual members encouraged prisoner self-policing and internal enforcement of institutional rules. Collective punishment systems transformed prisoner social dynamics from collective resistance toward internal conflict, as inmates faced choices between supporting resistance activities that would result in group penalties or cooperating with institutional authority to maintain individual welfare. This approach achieved behavioral compliance through peer pressure and social isolation of resistant individuals rather than relying exclusively on direct administrative coercion. The development of informant networks within prisoner populations provided administrators with intelligence capabilities superior to traditional monastery surveillance systems. Prisoners motivated by material incentives, ideological conversion, or fear of punishment provided detailed information about resistance activities, escape plans, organizational structures, and individual prisoner attitudes that enabled proactive rather than reactive security management. Informant systems proved particularly effective because they exploited political divisions among prisoner populations while providing administrators with real-time intelligence about developing problems before they reached crisis levels. The systematic cultivation of prisoner cooperation through selective incentives created internal monitoring capabilities that supplemented architectural surveillance with human intelligence gathering. Medical experimentation emerged as administrators attempted to address health crises caused by overcrowding, inadequate nutrition, and infectious disease outbreaks that threatened institutional stability. The monastery's geographic isolation made it suitable for testing medical interventions, pharmaceutical treatments, and public health measures without external oversight or interference from medical authorities unfamiliar with correctional requirements. Administrative documentation of medical procedures, treatment outcomes, and population health statistics created databases that informed systematic approaches to health management in institutional environments. Medical services evolved from basic emergency care toward comprehensive health management that served both humanitarian and administrative purposes by maintaining prisoner populations capable of productive labor while preventing disease outbreaks that could disrupt institutional operations. The controlled application of medical care proved effective as both treatment and behavioral modification tool when access to healthcare services was linked to cooperation with institutional authority. Prisoners who demonstrated compliance with work requirements and behavioral expectations received priority medical attention, while resistant individuals faced delayed or reduced healthcare access that encouraged conformity with institutional expectations. Administrative documentation systems evolved from traditional monastery record-keeping toward comprehensive correctional management databases that supported systematic rather than improvised decision-making processes. The development of detailed prisoner files, labor productivity records, disciplinary incident reports, and medical histories created information resources that enabled administrators to identify behavioral patterns, predict potential problems, and allocate resources efficiently. Documentation systems provided institutional memory that survived personnel changes while creating accountability mechanisms for administrative decisions and security protocols. Systematic record-keeping enabled continuous improvement in management techniques through analysis of successful and unsuccessful interventions with different types of prisoner populations under varying operational conditions. Guard force professionalization represented the most significant infrastructure investment in institutional stabilization, as administrators replaced improvised security personnel with trained correctional officers who received specific instruction in prisoner management techniques, emergency response protocols, and systematic surveillance methods. Professional guards proved essential for maintaining consistent institutional control across different shifts, seasonal variations, and administrative transitions. Training protocols for security personnel emphasized systematic approaches to prisoner supervision, conflict resolution, and emergency response, rather than improvised reactions based on individual judgment or traditional monastery practices. Professional guards operated according to established procedures that reduced arbitrary treatment while ensuring predictable responses to security incidents. Escape prevention systems developed through systematic analysis of successful and unsuccessful escape attempts, enabling administrators to enhance perimeter security, improve internal surveillance, and establish tracking protocols that reduced escape rates to statistically negligible levels. The monastery's geographic isolation, enhanced by technological improvements in communication and transportation, created virtually escape-proof containment that eliminated external security concerns. Why stabilization remained economically precarious, despite successful control measures, became apparent through ongoing resource constraint analysis. The monastery's geographic isolation that provided security advantages also created logistical disadvantages that increased operational costs beyond comparable mainland facilities. Transportation expenses for food, fuel, materials, and personnel exceeded budgetary allocations, requiring continuous external subsidies that made the institution economically dependent on state support rather than achieving traditional monastic self-sufficiency. Uncertainty management protocols addressed psychological stress experienced by both prisoners and administrators in the isolated institutional environment through structured routines, predictable procedures, and clear behavioral expectations that reduced anxiety and resistance among prisoner populations while providing administrative staff with consistent operational frameworks for managing complex situations. The critical systemic learning process involved documenting successful and unsuccessful management techniques for application at other correctional facilities throughout the expanding Soviet prison system. Administrators maintained detailed records of innovations, modifications, and adaptations that proved effective for managing prisoner populations in isolated facilities, creating institutional knowledge that became the foundation for systematic expansion of similar operations. Stabilization measures established operational principles that would define Gulag system management, geographic isolation to prevent escape and external support, self-sufficient economic production to offset administrative costs, systematic classification to enable customized prisoner management, professional staff training to ensure consistent institutional control, comprehensive documentation to support systematic operational improvement, and integrated production with punishment to serve simultaneous economic and correctional purposes. Forensic analysis of the Gulag system's expansion reveals how specific design elements developed at Solovetsky became standard features of Soviet correctional institutions, demonstrating that the monastery's influence extended far beyond its immediate operational success to provide the architectural and administrative template that would define prison camp design throughout the Soviet Union and influence correctional philosophy in other socialist states for decades. Inspection evidence from later Gulag facilities shows direct replication of Solovetsky's key design innovations through systematic adoption of organizational principles that had proven effective for managing large prisoner populations in isolated locations. The compound layout, principal central administrative buildings surrounded by residential barracks, workshop facilities, and perimeter security infrastructure appeared in virtually every subsequent camp facility, regardless of geographic location or specific operational purpose. Camp architects consistently implemented the monastery's integrated approach to combining living quarters, production facilities, and administrative infrastructure within single-controlled environments that eliminated external access while maximizing internal surveillance capabilities. This architectural standardization enabled rapid facility construction, while ensuring consistent operational capabilities across geographically diverse locations from Arctic regions to Central Asian deserts. Geographic isolation parameters developed at Solovetsky became standard site selection criteria for new facilities as administrators systematically chose locations that provided natural barriers to escape remote forests, Arctic regions, mountain areas, or island locations, while maintaining sufficient transportation access for personnel and supply logistics. The monastery's demonstration that isolation could eliminate escape problems without requiring extensive technological security systems influenced site selection throughout the Gulag expansion. Site selection analysis reveals mathematical relationships between isolation distance and security effectiveness that administrators applied systematically when establishing new facilities. Locations more than 100 kilometers from significant population centers provided effective containment without requiring enhanced perimeter security, while transportation corridors within 50 kilometers enabled cost-effective supply operations. The monastery had provided proof of concept for these geographic parameters through centuries of successful operation. Production integration models based on Solovetsky's economic approach became central to Gulag operations, as every major camp facility incorporated productive activities designed to offset administrative costs while providing behavioral control through mandatory labor. The monastery's demonstration that prison labor could generate economic value rather than representing pure administrative expense established the principle that correctional institutions should contribute to, rather than drain state resources. Economic analysis of Gulag production reveals systematic application of quota systems, incentive structures, and output targets derived directly from Solovetsky innovations. Camp administrators implemented workplace organization, production scheduling, and quality control measures that replicated successful monastery practices while adapting them to different industrial applications ranging from mining and logging to manufacturing and construction. Administrative classification systems developed at Solovetsky provided the organizational framework for managing diverse prisoner populations throughout the Gulag system, through systematic categorization protocols that enabled specialized treatment while maintaining overall institutional control. The monastery's experience with political prisoners, criminal offenders, religious dissidents, and administrative detainees informed the development of comprehensive classification systems that became standard throughout Soviet correctional operations. Classification effectiveness depended on systematic documentation and assessment procedures that administrators replicated across all facilities to ensure consistent treatment of similar prisoner categories. The monastery had developed standardized evaluation criteria, housing assignment protocols, and supervision levels that proved transferable to different institutional environments and prisoner populations. Staffing and training protocols reflected direct adoption of Solovetsky innovations in guard force management, administrative hierarchies, and professional development systems. The monastery's experience demonstrated the necessity of specialized training for correctional personnel, and provided practical curricula for preparing staff to manage large-scale prison operations in challenging environments ranging from extreme climates to difficult prisoner populations. Training standardization ensured consistent operational approaches across the expanding Gulag system, while enabling professional development opportunities that attracted qualified personnel to correctional careers. The monastery's demonstration that systematic training produced more effective results than improvised approaches influenced personnel policies throughout Soviet correctional administration. Technical documentation from Gulag facilities reveals systematic replication of Solovetsky operational procedures through standardized protocols for prisoner registration and tracking systems, work assignment and productivity monitoring, disciplinary procedures and punishment protocols, healthcare delivery and medical record management, food preparation and distribution logistics, and security protocols and emergency response procedures. Procedural standardization enabled administrative efficiency while ensuring consistent prisoner treatment regardless of facility location or local administrative variations. The monastery had developed comprehensive operational manuals that provided tested solutions for common correctional management problems, eliminating the need for trial and error approaches at new facilities. Regulatory institutionalization occurred as successful practices from Solovetsky became official policy throughout the Soviet correctional system, when the main administration of camps codified the monastery's innovations in operational manuals, training materials, and administrative regulations that standardized prison camp management across all facilities. This institutionalization ensured that Solovetsky approaches became permanent features of Soviet correctional policy rather than temporary expedients. The regulatory framework established legal foundations for Gulag operations while providing administrative guidance that enabled systematic expansion without requiring individual facility experimentation. Legal codification of Solovetsky practices created institutional continuity that survived political changes and administrative transitions throughout the Soviet period. Architectural standardization appeared as Soviet engineers developed standardized building designs based on Solovetsky facilities through systematic analysis of effective architectural elements and their adaptation to different climatic and geographic conditions. Barrack construction, workshop layouts, guard tower placement, and perimeter security designs followed patterns established at the monastery, while incorporating technological improvements and site-specific modifications. Standardized architectural plans enabled rapid camp construction while ensuring consistent operational capabilities across facilities serving different functions and housing different prisoner populations. The monastery's architectural solutions provided proven designs that eliminated experimental construction while reducing development costs and construction timelines. The most significant systemic lesson involved recognition that effective mass incarceration required abandoning traditional correctional philosophies that emphasized individual rehabilitation in favor of systematic population control that prioritized institutional stability, economic productivity, and administrative efficiency. Solovetsky demonstrated that prison systems could serve multiple state purposes simultaneously: punishment of political opposition, economic production, geographic development, and social control. This philosophical transformation established correctional principles that emphasized institutional rather than individual objectives while demonstrating that systematic approaches produced more reliable results than traditional rehabilitation methods. The monastery's success provided empirical evidence supporting administrative policies that would characterize Soviet correctional philosophy throughout the system's existence. International influence extended beyond the Soviet Union as other socialist states adopted similar approaches to correctional institution design and operation based on documented Gulag effectiveness and systematic operational procedures. The monastery's model influenced prison camp development in Eastern European countries, China, North Korea, and Cuba, establishing a distinctive socialist approach to mass incarceration that differed systematically from capitalist prison systems. International adoption validated Solovetsky innovations while demonstrating their transferability across different political systems and cultural contexts. The monastery's institutional solutions proved applicable to diverse social and economic conditions while maintaining consistent effectiveness for achieving systematic population control through integrated punishment and production systems. Radiological legacy assessment reveals that Solovetsky's influence persisted long after the facility's closure and the Soviet Union's collapse, as Russian Federation correctional institutions retain architectural and administrative features derived from monastery innovations. Contemporary correctional approaches to combining punishment with productive activity continue to reflect Solovetsky precedents while adapting them to modern legal and administrative requirements. The persistence of Solovetsky influences demonstrates the fundamental effectiveness of institutional solutions developed through centuries of practical experience rather than theoretical correctional models. Modern correctional administrators continue to confront the same basic challenges of population control, economic sustainability, and institutional stability that the monastery had addressed through systematic institutional design. Psychological impact documentation shows that the monastery's transformation from sacred to carceral space created profound symbolic associations that influenced broader Soviet approaches to institutional control, while establishing precedents for systematic state appropriation of religious institutions throughout the Soviet Union. The demonstration that religious institutions could serve secular correctional purposes validated policies that subordinated religious autonomy to state administrative requirements. The forensic investigation concludes that the Solovetsky Monastery's transformation was not an isolated historical anomaly, but a systematic process that revealed fundamental compatibility between certain types of religious institutional design and modern correctional requirements. The monastery's architecture, administrative systems, and operational procedures provided a proven template that Soviet administrators recognized as superior to purpose-built correctional facilities. Evidence synthesis demonstrates that the monastery succeeded as a correctional institution precisely because its religious design had anticipated and solved the essential problems of mass incarceration through centuries of institutional evolution. The systematic replication of Solovetsky approaches throughout the Soviet correctional system confirms that the monastery functioned as the prototype and training ground for systematic mass incarceration that defined Soviet correctional practice rather than an experimental facility requiring modification for broader application.